Mr. Brower has received a Bachelor's of Electrical Engineering degree from Thapar Institute of Engineering and Technology and an MBA from the University of Delhi. From 1977 until last year in 2004, Mr. Brower was with Ranbaxy Laboratories Limited, where he became CEO and Managing Director. Under Mr. Brower's leadership, Ranbaxy became a leading globally recognized pharmaceutical company. Mr. Brower led acquisitions and investments in Brazil, Germany, Japan, France, formed a joint venture with Eli Lilly and Company, and has entered into a major research alliance with GlaxoSmithKline. Last year, the company crossed the $1 billion revenue milestone, and Mr. Brower retired. By the way, Ranbaxy is the largest pharmaceutical company in India. Today, Mr. Brower is an investor and chairman of the board of GVK Bioscience, a research company involved in medicinal chemistry, informatics, clinical research, and diagnostics based in Hyderabad. Among his other accomplishments, Mr. Brower is also today the director of the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India, which is equivalent to the U.S. Federal Reserve System. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Devendra Brower.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege and an honor for me to present my talk on India as a global innovator. My talk and presentation flow will follow these slides. Let me first give you an economic snapshot of India. Last year, ending March 2005, India posted the biggest ever trade deficit in the history of the country, which amounted to something like $26 billion. Ordinarily and in normal times, this would have been a disaster or a catastrophe for a country like India. But this event and this record trade deficit created no ripples in our country because it was balanced by two factors of human resource remittances and skills that India exported in the form of repatriations that foreign resident Indians sent back home, almost $26 billion, which makes India the largest human resource remittances back to the parent country. Second in line was Mexico, which was around $9 billion, and China was at $3 billion. In terms of software and IT-enabled services, India exported $17 billion worth of exports. These are not recorded in the export figures that I mentioned here in the economic snapshot. These are called invisibles. So if we add the two together, the skill-based or the human resource-based foreign exchange earnings that the country had amounted to something like $43 billion, which helped balance the country, the trade deficit that it had encountered last year. The FDI flow, which is in the form of foreign direct investment in the country, is very small compared to the size of the economy that we have in India. It only is around $6 billion. And this is partly due to insufficient liberalization, slow pace of decision making, and bottlenecks in our infrastructure-related industries and projects, which accounts for this very slow pace of foreign direct investment flow into the country. However, if we take the portfolio investments by foreign funds in the form of equity investments by global funds in emerging markets, India is the highest recipient of global equity funds around the world, amongst the emerging markets, accounting for almost 18% of the total inflow of foreign equity funds. And the reasons are well known: a very well-developed stock market, a very evolved financial and banking sector, and also excellent governance by the private sector in the country. If you look at the structure, it is very much like the USA, where services sector now accounts for almost 51% of the economy, I think USA is a similar percentage. Though agriculture, which has been the mainstay of economy, and also India with its large population, requires to be self-sufficient in food production and in agriculture, which has been the bane of India in the late 60s and early 70s. Till in the middle 70s, India was able to overcome its food shortages. And before that, of course, you are all aware that India lived on food aid from the United States to cover its food needs. But from mid-70s, India has now evolved into one of the largest producers of food products, being number 1 or 2 in most of the items like milks, rice, and wheat. And this sector now is set for major reforms in our country, which will give a tremendous boost to agro-based industries. And some of the policy makers and planners feel that after the IT-led software explosion of exports from India, this is the next sector or the next horizon for growth and development in India. Because India is today the largest producer of vegetables and fruit in the world, largest producer of milk, second highest in wheat and rice. And a lot of that food is wasted because the country doesn't have agro-processing industries. And this is one of the biggest areas for future growth, which some of you may be interested. On the services side, trade, transport, hotel, and communications account for 45% of the services segment of the economy, whereas banking, finance, insurance, and business services account for the balance 26%. And social, which is public administration, defense, and personal services, account for 29% of this services sector. If you study this distribution, you will again find that India, because of the services dominance in its GDP, is set to become a major service provider in the world economy. If you look at India's past and the future projection which the Goldman Sachs report gave, it was the world's 17th largest economy till about 1990. In 1990, due to the insular policies and the socialistic pattern of the economy that was followed, focusing on heavy industries and self-reliance and self-sufficiency, which hurt cost and productivity and efficiency in the economy, India was forced to undertake reforms in 1991 because it had a precarious foreign exchange position and was left with enough foreign exchange only to import 1 month of requirements in 1991. But since then, the reforms have been undertaken, and it has now become the 12th largest economy in the last 10 years, growing at a pace of over 5%. I think the average is around 6%, and is all set to become the 3rd largest economy in the world, growing below 9% for the next several decades. One of the reasons for India's growth has been the consistent trend it has been exhibiting vis-à-vis select countries, which I have showed in the next slide, that all countries which had a GDP of about 100 billion plus, barring China, India has had the highest growth rate over the last 10 years, averaging around 6%. And we also feel, our policy planners feel, that India will maintain this pace in coming decades, growing by 8% or 7%, and not touching the levels of 10 or 11%, which China did in the earlier part. But India will sustain over the next 40, 50 years a growth rate of 5%. And that is why it will have a more balanced and sustainable growth in the coming decades. If we look at the drivers of growth and transformation in our country, the biggest driver of growth is the consensus in our democratic system, and all parties now are fully committed to reforms in our country. And as you are aware, consensus once achieved in a democracy, it's very, very difficult to reverse consensus once that is achieved. In our country, the private sector is extremely entrepreneurial and is very, very outward looking and is globalizing in a very fast manner. Just to give you an idea, in GDP terms, China is almost 2.5 times the GDP of India. But if you take the top 10 private business groups in India, their size is twice that of the top 10 Chinese companies, indicating that Indian private sector, even during the non-reform periods, has been very buoyant and has been finding solutions to interact internationally. In 1991, when the reforms were undertaken, there were three things which happened: decontrol, deregulation, and delicensing. In deregulation, the government permitted easy access to foreign technology, simplification of investment procedures, both for international companies to invest in India and for Indian companies to invest internationally. Foreign exchange controls were removed and relaxed, and barring capital account, India is now fully convertible on its foreign exchange front. The only thing which we are not allowed is to repatriate for personal consumption capital out of the country. Other than that, India has a fully convertible currency now. In delicensing, India freed its licensing restrictions which had inhibited its growth for almost 40 years after independence. The economic model for capacity creation and output, which had been compromised due to these policies, was freed, and you can see that the growth which has taken place after 91 at 6% year after year. I want to give two examples, though I have listed maybe 5 or 6 examples in the slide, but I want to give example of telecom, which was an industry which was not existing in terms of the modern telecom industry or mobile phone industry in the 90s. India went for the best technology and the best infrastructure in telecom and has probably today one of the best networks in the world. It did not have any baggage of old technology and old networks, so therefore it could invest in the best technology that was available, state of the art. Not only that, Indian companies also, it's estimated today that directly or indirectly, Indian companies control almost 35% of the telecom cable network in the world, which is laid under sea. They have made acquisitions from US companies, they have made joint ventures with Singapore companies, and they have bought up more and more cable network, leading to a situation where, because of the bandwidth requirements of India and the service industry that India is focusing on, it now indirectly controls and directly controls almost 1/3 of the world's global telecom network, cable network. This is a fact which is not often heard about or talked about, but that's the picture which has actually made India deliver some of the global services that it is doing currently. The second implication of these reforms was that it touched some of the industries which were written off in the manufacturing sector. Because of the socialistic pattern which emphasized on heavy industry and big public sector undertakings, India's manufacturing sector, which was the private sector, was crippled with inefficiency and lack of productivity. With the reforms that have taken place, we now see India's manufacturing companies coming back into their own. In our country, often it is mentioned that China is the factory of the world. Conceded, and that is the point which our policy makers and policy planners have conceded. But now there is a new paradigm and a new discussion which is taking place in our country, that why cannot India be the second factory of the world? Okay, we missed being the first factory, but why not the second factory and an alternative source of consumption patterns that are emerging in the world? And I think that's what some of the sectors which I will highlight later are focusing upon. Another point which I want to emphasize here is that some of the industries which were not touched by the socialistic pattern, or the newer industries which have emerged in the late 80s or early 90s, have performed exceedingly well from India. And my reference is to the information technology and information technology enabled services industry, which has really grown in the last 15 years. This was a non-existent industry virtually 2 decades before today. And therefore the government had no control over it. It just evolved on its own because of the fact that it did not have to create manufacturing infrastructure or on-the-ground infrastructure which had government intervention. It flourished. And today, as you are aware, that India, in terms of its IT services, in the global scene of things, serves 45% of the total outsourced market globally for IT services is served by India. And this figure is set to cross 50% this year. And this is a result of how, if you allow an entrepreneurial sector, not the inhibition of the government or very restrictive policies and controls, how a very entrepreneurial private sector can set new standards of corporate growth and development. One of the reasons which led to India's reforms in the 90s was the fact that the slow liberalization and the controls had virtually made our cost of doing business about 15 to 16% more expensive than some of the competing economies. Our interest rates were accounting for almost 6 to 7% differential. Our inflation was taking a toll of 4%, and the rest was transaction costs, which is bureaucracy, corruption, procedures, micro-controls. All these issues were accounting for the balance. And this was a situation which the private sector faced in the 90s in India, where we were, because of our repressive policies that the government had imposed, the Soviet-style policies, we were outcosted by almost 15 to 18% in the scheme of things vis-a-vis our competing countries. That has changed. The interest rates are down to 6%, and currently our rupee, which is our currency, is appreciating and has appreciated about 6% in the last 2 years. And if you see the BRIC report is saying that the total growth in the GDP of the BRIC countries, 1/3 of that will come through currency appreciation, and only 2/3 will come through real growth. So India is one of the countries where we are seeing, out of the 4 countries, India is the only country where we are seeing now rupee appreciation taking place, though China has artificially pegged its currency and is under pressure to make its currency appreciate. Another major factor which influences the growth and transformation of India is the demography of the country. If you see here, we were a very poor country in the 90s, with almost 475 million people under the poverty line. And because of the reforms which were undertaken, within a short span of 10 years, the poverty levels have been drastically reduced, with the result that by 2007, we would have halved, in a span of 15 years, we would have halved the level of poverty in the country through these very, very progressive reforms. And that has led to a rising demand and affluence amongst the people. And the consumption levels are increasing. As I mentioned earlier, this year's trade deficit, though it was due to oil consumption and oil prices also, but part of the trade deficit that took place was the huge capacity that India is now creating, productive capacity in its manufacturing industry, and also the rising consumption of demand from this increasingly affluent society that is building up. On the other side, we have a situation where India is expected to have the highest potential workforce by 2020 in the world, having a surplus of almost, it's estimated of 45 million people who will be deployed on serving global countries and companies. And 25% of this population will be in the age group of 20 to 35 years. And most of them will have higher education focus, creating knowledge pool of workers to service global services. Just to give you some statistics, India has about 270 universities. It has 1,500 research institutes, which is the largest publicly and government-funded research institutes in the world. And it has 10,000 to 11,000 higher education centers. India produces 400,000 engineers and diploma holders every year. Against that, the United States figure is about 58,000. So just to give you a backdrop of what it is. And therefore, I think the question I raise, and it is often asked of me whenever I am delivering a talk or in our discussions with international business people, that should we look at India as a resource or should we look at India as a market? I think the answer is that in the past, pre-reforms and immediately post-reforms, India was looked at mostly by international companies as a country from where you can borrow and take resource. But increasingly, India is looked at as a country which will not only give you resource, but will also give you a huge market for consumption of goods and services. I will quote from an example of General Electric, which is a very successful company, one of the largest companies in the world, and very successful in India and China. Recently, Jeff Immelt was in India, and he was asked this question, what has been your experience in India and China? He said when they started out in both countries, they were almost same-sized in both India and China. Today, India's business of General Electric is close to $1 billion, whereas business in China is about $4.8 billion. That shows the pace at which China has moved up. But he gave a caveat to that. He said, whatever we planned for India as a market, nothing came out the way they had planned. And that's a caution for all of you. He says, nothing worked as planned. So they had to re-engineer their business plan, and they struck a gold mine in the form of resource that was available in India. They created the largest General Electric knowledge center or R&D center in India, which employs 1,700 people and is set to go to about 2,400 people in the next 3 years, which is filing patents and some of the most complex technology patents on behalf of General Electric out of India. But it also did another thing. It set up a global outsourcing center for supply of services to worldwide General Electric out of India, which became the largest outsourcing firm in India. And recently, it was sold for over $500 million in sheer profit to General Electric. So I think he answered the question by saying that while we may have a business of 1 billion versus China's 4.8 billion, but in fact, over the last 10 years, General Electric, in the form of resource that it took from India, was worth several $1 billion in terms of skills, R&D, technology, as well as outsourcing. I'm continuing with the demographics because that is one of the areas where we are debating in our country whether India's population is going to be an asset or it's going to become a burden in the future. And so therefore I'm trying to relate the aging population phenomena in most of the developed countries, which is shortage of workforce, therefore potential decline in the GDP rates, which has been factored in by the Goldman Sachs report. There will be pressure on social security and pension system, and nowhere it is felt more than in healthcare and related services, which is going to become the biggest issue in the G6 economies in coming years, making or reaching expense levels which are unsustainable in the G6 countries. Then I was reading an estimate of the Japanese healthcare system requirements in the coming years, and it is estimated that their total spend on healthcare will be $4 trillion if they go the way Japan is going, which is totally unsustainable in the terms of the overall Japanese economy. So therefore, the question is India's growing population, and I have tried to plot the population trends up to 2050. Russia is already declining, all is now static population. G6 will start declining after 2050. Brazil will decline after 2050. China will decline after 2032. And India will keep growing up to 2050. So the asset side is well known. And the burden side is that this potential surplus of workforce could become a huge burden if India is not able to find commensurate jobs for this educated class. And India's policies, therefore, have to get attuned to this demographic reality that we are facing to ensure that in agriculture and in manufacturing and services, there is enough opportunity and jobs that are created over the next 20 to 30 years. There is another silver lining, though, that India is largely a self-employed country. And because of the service culture in personal services and some of the other services I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of self-employment in India where small entrepreneurs do their own. So that will also come in handy as we go along and face the surplus. This is what it looks like today in 2002, or it looked like. I have tried to plot the economy size with the per capita income that it will be, what it was in 2002 and what it will be in 2050. India will, of course, be, if everything goes well, the third largest economy in the world. But it will have one variation. It will continue to have a very low per capita income in compared to other countries, either the G6 or even China. And therefore, for companies which are trying to do business or evolving a long-term strategy to come to India, they have to contend with a very different economy and at a very different marketplace. It is easy to transfer products, services, technologies from one developed economy like the US to another developing economy or developed economy like a Singapore or in Australia. The kind of products, services, technologies are virtually transferable without much modifications. But India will be an enigma and a tough one in terms of that factor, because it will have a unique situation quite unlike the developed economies even 30 years from now. A very large economy, the third largest, but still per capita incomes not very large. India dynamics will not imply a ready-made market for products and services as akin to the Western companies. So therefore, linking consumer spending with appropriate products and technologies will be key to success for people who want to do business in India. It will require very innovative and differentiated business and marketing solutions, unlike what will happen in some of the developed markets elsewhere. I will quote an example from Professor C.K. Prahlad, who is one of the world's leading strategy consultant. And he focuses on this issue, what I am trying to raise here. What he says is that companies, Indian companies, international companies, foreign companies, they must focus at the bottom end of the pyramid. I showed you the demographic profile of affluence and consumption patterns earlier. But Professor Prahlad says companies must focus at the lowest end of or the bottom end of the pyramid in this whole structure. And why? He gives an example that currently an ice cream cone in India costs about 30 cents. I mean, you will be surprised that it is so cheap, but it is between 25 to 30 cents. But he has given a challenge to some of the ice cream manufacturers in India that if you can deliver a cone between 5 to 10 cents, an excellently packaged product delivered in refrigerated containers to the rural end of India, this will be the biggest ice cream market in the world in value terms. So that's the kind of challenge this slide reflects that companies have in serving the Indian market, because it will, because of its low per capita income, even 20 years from now, it will be a very price conscious market requiring changes to technology and products. Some of the challenges to growth that we face as a country: infrastructure is our single biggest challenge and the biggest concern that I think Stephen mentioned in case of Russia, the infrastructure that is required. India's problems are mind-boggling in terms of the investment that is required in infrastructure. While infrastructure may be the biggest concern and bottleneck, but it also is the single largest opportunity for people who want to do business in India. Because in the next 10 years to 15 years, huge investments are going to be made in each of the sectors which have been listed here. I have the green boxes here show areas where there has been very positive movement already in terms of reforms that were undertaken. The amber ones show that there is moderate improvements taking place, while the large number of red boxes show that a lot is needed to be done in the coming years. But just to give you some examples and perspective on this slide. India is the 6th largest electricity generator in the world, but is incapable to manage and due to rate regulations, and is an extremely non-reliable electric supply country, and requires $200 billion in the next 10 years to meet its own internal needs, just in power sector alone. In ports, our turnaround time of Indian ports is about 2 to 3 times more than Dubai or even Colombo, and therefore it's a bottlenecked area requiring modernization, mechanization, improvements, and this has begun to happen. Port privatization is taking place. Aviation, civil aviation is one of the areas which has made very positive moves. Just to give you an example, currently India is served, the whole country is served by 180 aircraft. At any point of time, we have about 180 aircraft flying in the Indian skies. At the recent Paris Air Show, Indian companies, private airlines placed orders for 350 jets, which made almost 45 to 50% of the total orders placed at the Paris Air Show. So that shows the level of, if you open up the market, if you open up a little wedge, the entrepreneurial spirit that pervades India leads to a huge business and development. And going forward, incidentally, since we had one of the speakers who is in the aircraft industry, I was reading that by 2020, India's aircraft industry or aircraft market will equal that of Japan's, though China will still remain maybe 2 to 3 times larger than us, giving a huge infrastructure boost to the economy. On roads, we have the 2nd largest network in the world, but still we lack the government's total investments that are required to build up. Of course, we have announced plans to build 35,000 kilometers of roads, and out of which about 14,000 are under implementation. And most of the contracts here are going to companies in the Southeast Asia. Malaysian companies are very active. Some Korean companies are very active. Japanese are very active. So international companies are participating in the infrastructure building exercise of India. The second generation of reforms, which are the red blocks, will focus on these red blocks in terms of infrastructure, but also on labor and the financial sector. And rural sector reforms, as I mentioned earlier, are expected to unleash a huge economic activity in India in the coming years. Some of the challenges that we face to growth and some of the issues that you have to keep in mind while doing business in India is the weak governance, bureaucracy, I mentioned to you earlier also, suboptimal effectiveness of administration. We have a central-state relationship. We don't have a federal system like it works here. The states are very powerful. 40% of the regulations which are holding back productive growth in India are controlled by states. And they are individual states controlled by different political parties. So, and they have 40% of the regulations under their domain and 60% come under the central domain. So this leads to a micro-regulation problem both at the state and at the central level. And it's estimated that this is currently costing us about 1 to 1.5% of the GDP every year by not taking enough action on regulations. On the social sector, education, a lot has been said about India's education. It is true that India concentrated on the higher levels of education. It has the best engineering colleges. It has some of the best management institutes. It has the best technology centers comparable to anything else in the world. But when we come to primary and secondary education, while 81% of the population is enrolled in the age group of 6 to 14 in some kind of school, but the effort, as we see, is mainly on enrollment and retention and not on providing quality education. And there is a history for this kind of an output that we see, because in the traditional Soviet Union system which India followed, the emphasis was on large-scale public sector and large institutions or large sector industry and public sector industry. And the most ignored segments became the two segments of health and education in India. And that is the result we are facing today. Literacy rate is still only 65% for men and about 53% for women, which is nowhere near, while we have states where literacy level is 100%, but largely as a country, we have a lot to do on education. Healthcare, I talked of the healthcare in the developed countries, but we have grossly inadequate healthcare provision in our country. Our government spending or public spending on healthcare is less than 1% of the GDP, while the overall spending by the country is around 3%. And this balanced 2% spending is provided by private individuals. Due to lack of a comprehensive health insurance policy in the country, the burden of health and health indices falls on the individuals and on the families. And that explains also some of the, I mentioned earlier 24 billion worth of remittances were sent by Indians back home, because there's a very traditional family system and family bonding in our country where people feel that to provide for health, to provide for education, and to also provide for safety for the future, people must save money. And due to the family bonding and also the fact that it's a democracy and therefore people feel safe with the money sent back home, there is this kind of situation, a dichotomy, where individuals are getting funded by their own savings. But this healthcare situation is unlikely to change, and the government of India does not have funds, or the system does not have funds to support the healthcare needs of the country. So this is largely going to be very similar to United States again, where health costs are privately funded or funded by the employers through an insurance plan. So what India is now seeing is a lot of foreign insurance companies and entering into this area, and therefore the healthcare will take the predictable route of insurance-funded private healthcare and not a government-funded healthcare. There are positives in it, and on the housing I will not spend much time, but just to say that real estate reforms are underway, and this sector is going to grow tremendously in coming years. So where does it put India? What is the emerging sources of competitive advantage of India? I've tried to summarize it in this slide. On the strength side, the country has a very high level and high numbers of skilled human resource. It does services and provides products not only at low cost but with high quality, and increasingly with additional value add. It has proficiency in English language, and English is the common language across the country in every state. So it is, of course, a very big advantage when you do business with English-speaking world that we have today. It's quite vertically integrated. One of the advantages that we had of the Soviet system that we followed in our industry is that it has created a vertical integration due to the self-sufficiency syndrome that we followed. So there are a lot of industries which supply locally produced inputs to the larger industry. So we don't have to depend on many industries outside, and this well-developed industry base with ancillaries is actually now proving to be an advantage that we have in our country. About education and research institutes, I have mentioned. Domestic savings. I think domestics, many times this question is asked, that how is India funding its investments? China, of course, has the highest investments in terms of domestic savings, around 38% or 37%. But most of the Asian economies, most of the Asian countries, there is a culture of savings. And people save for the future. People save for their children. People save for any adverse event that may take place in future. So there is a lot of savings that are kept in the banks and in the system. India, because of the positive impact of reforms that has taken place, is now around 25% of the savings level. And most of this savings is invested every year. If you see the investment levels and capital formation levels in India, there is a direct correlation between the savings saved and put in the banks and the actual investments that are taking place on the ground. The competitive advantage of information technology, the age of digitization and connectivity, there is no escape from that. That's inevitable. It's taking place. Internet has, the book has been talked of, Friedman's book. And luckily, as a country and as a society, we are best placed in this situation. I think only next to United States in terms of products and technology. In domain knowledge, we have a very strong private sector in the country with very strong domain knowledge in select industries. And therefore, it is combining the new age information technology with the domain knowledge to create totally new sets of products and services and industries which are not existing today. And of course, favorable age profile of the country is adding this. So what will India do in future, and what is for you to look at India? In providing global services, I think it will be one of the best destinations. It is currently the best destination along with China, but I think it's increasingly emerging that this will be India's niche and forte in coming years. It also is very interesting that where you need scope economies, which means small or very moderate volumes, but very large variety and at very low cost. I think that's another area where India is emerging as a global destination for companies. To give you an example, where you want to design automotive components with very high level of precision and engineering and multiple components, but not very large runs because these are prototypes for few, I think India is the place. And of course, in mass manufacturing, as I mentioned earlier, it is aiming to be the second factory of the world, having lost the position to China as the first factory of the world. So where is the industries and the kind of businesses that people from Indiana or United States or other countries can look at? This is a representative slide and not a comprehensive one. So it's just take it for at its face value. But of course, on top is the information technology and information technology enabled services. This industry is expected to grow to $80 billion in the next 4 years from its current figure of around $25 billion, making it one of the largest, if not the largest industry of India. Providing global services, scope economies. Where we have lost out in this segment is in mass production in terms of hardware. Some companies are trying to catch up, but I think the concentration is on global services and scope economies. I would also give you some of the statistics in IT because it's of topical interest, because many times people talk of job losses and create of outsourcing issues. Actually, in the pharmaceutical industry, I will give this example in the context of the pharmaceutical industry. And I will take a very small example in the area of medicinal chemistry. The current strength of medicinal chemists in the whole of United States, with all the research pharma, is about 47,000 medicinal chemists are employed. If medicinal chemists have to be outsourced to countries like China and India, the two most popular destinations for outsourcing chemistry work, it would appear that most of the jobs can be outsourced to these countries because it's at 1/5 or 1/4 of the cost. But however, there's a different way of looking at it, and the pharmaceutical industry, at least the research pharma industry, Lilly is represented here, is looking at it differently. With the new genome targets that are available, currently only 500 targets are worked upon by the pharma industry. It is estimated that for some of the new diseases which do not have cures and therapeutic solutions today will require tackling another 500 to 600 new targets for creating new medicines. Now, if that was to happen, the requirements of medicinal chemists in United States research pharma will go up from 47,000 to 75,000, just to tackle the extra targets that are available as part of the genome project to discover new medicines and to bring newer life sciences technologies. And what is the obvious solution to this? Faced with the productivity problem that currently this industry has in United States and Europe, the obvious solution will be to not to lose jobs of the 47,000, but to create the extra 20,000 jobs in China and India in medicinal chemistry. And that is happening. And that is happening, same quality, same kind of output. I was talking to the head of India operations of a very major American company. I won't name the company, but a very major engineering company of the United States, one of the top engineering companies. They do drawings in India, ordinary mechanical engineering drawings. They have about 800 mechanical engineers in India in their office. And he was telling me that in their San Francisco office, it takes on an average 3.5 to 4 days for a complicated mechanical engineering drawing that his company's engineer does. In India, his average is 1.8 days for the same drawing, and at 1/5 the cost. So he was asking me the question. He said, why should I not shift everything here? Because I'm getting in half the time at 1/5 the cost, a much better productivity. So that's the paradigm, some of the issues which companies will have to balance as they move internationally to countries like India and China. And there is a strong ecosystem that we have of R&D. Just to give you another example in biotech, because I have mentioned this as an industry which is flourishing in India, we have currently 40 research institutes only in the area of biotechnology in our country, about 15,000 scientists working on in 200 biotech companies. And currently, we are just making initial steps in this area, but by 2009, it is estimated that India will be 10% of the world biotechnology market, reaching a level of about 5 to 6 billion. So this is the representative, not comprehensive list of businesses which are going to do well. I'm not going to discuss each and every one of them. I can answer any question that you may have. But that's where the country is going. Emerging sources of India's competitive advantage. This is what is happening, that multinational companies are now creating R&D presence in India. And most of them, over 125 Fortune 500 companies have now some kind of R&D activity in India in the form of full-fledged centers or just some employees or some collaborations or some joint ventures in the country. And this, they are not only doing product development for emerging markets, because India is a typical, as I mentioned earlier, a typical lab for developing products for similar emerging markets. In fact, Unilever, it develops washing soaps and toilet soaps in India for the Indian market, and then has successfully transferred that technology and products to Brazil, because the market dynamics are very similar. So they run the test lab and the cost structure and fine-tune it in India, and then transfer the technology and the product to Brazil. A very successful bridge, that India-Brazil bridge, has been built by Unilever by creating products which were totally and indigenously developed in India. There are companies also developing end-to-end products for the global markets out of India. This latest Boeing jet, which is 787 Dreamliner jet, which is often talked of as Boeing's next big leap into aviation, is developing it's with HCL Technologies the software for everything from navigation systems to landing gears and to cockpit control. The entire software is being done in India by the Boeing company for its new Dreamliner jet, which is called 787, now 787. And similarly, the list goes on and on. I will end this this slide and my talk by saying we have a president in our country. He's a scientist, and it's a very unusual. He's a very unusual president. He's President Abdul Kalam of our country. He has broken away from the tradition of the past. He spends most of his time, of course he does his official duties as a president of the country, so he meets everybody and the dignitaries and so on. But he has made it known that he wants to spend time with two sets of people, the scientists and the children of our country. He has every day he must meet a certain number of hours, either children from school and colleges who are invited for tea to the presidential palace every day whenever he's in town, because he says this is the youth and the future of our country. And secondly, the scientists which are going to give the lead to the development and solution to some of the problems of our country. And he has this buzzword which has become very popular in India. He says the growth of my country, this is President Kalam's words, the growth of my country is dependent on three techs: the infotech, the biotech, and the nanotech. He says if India can combine these three technologies, India can dictate a lot, for not only for its own people, but also for the economics of the global world as we see it tomorrow. The last slide, some takeaway thoughts from this presentation, what it means for companies in future in India. We have to prepare for coalition politics. It's very much It's more stable than Italy, because Italy, since Italy has had 60 governments since the World War II. I don't think India will have that many, but I think we have to prepare for coalition politics. There is a pressure of coalition polity which retards and slows the decision making. Just to give you an example, all the oil prices which have gone up from $35, our current oil prices in our country, like yours country, is artificially pegged. Actually, United States also has an artificial price for oil energy. The petrol prices in United States are not free market prices. So similarly, in our country, the oil prices or the petrol and diesel prices are pegged at $35 per barrel, which it was. Currently, it's at $60. And the leftists and the communists in the coalition government are not allowing the government to increase the prices of petrol and diesel, because they are saying it is anti-average common man. And this is leading to bleeding of the oil companies for months on end, which will eventually have to be funded by the government through the taxpayers' money. So it's all an unproductive effort, but that's the reality of coalition politics in our country. Private sector role in social sector, education and health, it's going to gain preeminence in these two sectors, because till now education has been a government and centralized subject. It is not open to privatization. But this is going to change dramatically, and some very optimistic people, I'm not one of them, feel that India is going to become one of the education hubs in the world. I don't subscribe to that, but I think there is a possibility that we may become like that. But you will see increasingly lot of investments and intervention by the private sector to sort out this problem in the social sector. In the governance by industry, positive intervention in governance by industry, and this is what we call as inclusive growth in our country. Some of the reforms that have taken place since the 90s have not touched the common man as it should. They have not. So they have percolated down to the middle class. They have not gone down to the grassroots level. So the government is now in a situation where it doesn't have enough resources, because it's a democracy. It cannot just change policies and things at its will, because there is a people to answer for or to answer to. So what is happening is that increasingly the private sector industry will have to play a role, an interventionist role, in making sure that this huge burden of population and inclusive growth that we talk of is not left unattended or left attended only by the government. Because if that happens, there could be a situation where there are social tensions in the country, because the people are not seeing the impact of reforms on a consolidated, comprehensive basis across the various sections of the society. And this is again happening, and luckily for us as a country, we have a fantastic network of NGOs, non-government organization. It is unparalleled network anywhere in the world. We have an NGO in every situation in our country, where volunteers, people from society, men and women, they go out and serve the country, participating in various forms of non-government organizations, non-profit organizations. That's the fabric which works at the grassroots, and I think that's a help which has sustained us all these years. And now that's going to be funded increasingly by the private sector to create a world-class inclusive growth, which we expect and hope for in the coming years. And lastly, I think there has to be a greater accountability and transparency in our government actions. I think India has, being a democracy, had followed a system where government was not accountable, because there was a very nice correlation between, in the old system, there was a very nice correlation between the bureaucrat, the politician, and the large industrial house. So they had reserved the licenses, between themselves. So the one was giving favors, the other was getting favors, the third was obliging the favors. I think that system has been totally destroyed in our country, thanks to the reforms, but also to the democratic institutions that prevail in the country. Somebody mentioned in the earlier talk, judicial systems. Indian judicial systems may come late, they may dispense justice late, but they will dispense justice. And that is one of the biggest safety nets that foreign companies have in doing business in India. You will get justice. It may be delayed, but it will never be denied. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the organizers, especially the Dean of the University and also Professor Dhanraj, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you and share my views on how India is transferring itself from an ordinary democratic country, not so rich, developing, to a global superpower and as an innovator. Thank you.